sold one of the victims some milk before she was killed, said she'd seen a foreign-looking man who she said looked Italian. Some newspapers then discussed these new immigrants and their alleged strange customs. The New York Tribune wrote, "It's well known that among certain ignorant immigrants from the south of Europe, there is a superstitious belief that by sacrificing a little girl, they can be cured of certain complaints. This immediately put Italians' lives at risk from the mob, even though the story was based on nothing but an idle rumor. Alas, the New York Ripper was never found, and things eventually calmed down. The next killer deserves a place in the serial killer hall of infamy. If there was such a thing as the Ripper's Ripper, it would be this guy, the worst of the worst, the Cleveland Torso Murderer." The story of this very real Ripper takes place around the southeast side of Cleveland, Ohio, in an area that was known as Kingsbury Run. That's why the killer was also referred to as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The killer gained his nickname after his custom of dismembering all of his victims, 7 men and 5 women, who were all found in pieces here, there, and everywhere. The hand that killed him obviously knew a lot about anatomy, just as Jack the Ripper had. As happened in London, the Cleveland Ripper chose poor, disenfranchised people as his victims. Modern researchers have called such people less dead, because when they're dead, they don't matter as much as other folks with a higher social status. The Kingsbury Run area was then known as the Hobo Jungle, famous for its gambling dens, raucous brothels, vagrants, booze, and nightly punch-ups. It was one of the so-called Hoovervilles, depressed and often violent shantytowns that popped up all over the U.S. during the era of the Great Depression. Still, the authorities did try to get the man. They even put Elliot Ness on the case, the leader of the so-called Untouchables, that went after the illegal booze maverick Al Capone during Prohibition. It was the sheer gruesomeness of the case that compelled the U.S. government to send their best man. In September 1934, a woman who was in her mid-30s was found. Well, her torso and thighs were, which were reported back then as rotting slabs of human flesh, found on the shores of Lake Erie. 2 fishermen on Lake Erie later said they found her head bobbing up and down in the water. She became known as the Lady of the Lake, after a young girl swimming in the lake said she saw a hand waving at her from the water. What's notable is that the coroner, Mr. A.J. Pierce, said there were signs of a preservative chemical on the skin of the victim. Where would one find such chemicals? You'll see soon. It was about a year later that 2 young men were found, each missing their head. One body had been drained of blood. Coroner Pierce said the cause of death was decapitation. The victim was later identified as 28-year-old Edward Anderson, described by newspapers and cops as a snotty punk who occasionally got involved with prostitution and weed. The other body, which had signs of a chemical preservative on the skin, was not identified. Both men were also missing their manhood. Notably, unlike Jack the Ripper, the mutilations happened while the men were still alive, but the decapitation part was given as the actual cause of death. This was utterly brutal, but cops believed the killer must have drugged the victims first. The Cleveland News at the time had asked, what fantastic chemistry of the civilized mind converted him into a human butcher? In January, June, and July of 1936, more bodies were found, and the signature of the murders was the same. They were headless, and if they were men, they were found missing their genitals. In September of that year, a man tripped over something while trying to hop onto a train. He soon realized it was the upper half of a person's torso. When the police were recovering the other half from a muddy pool nearby, 600 people turned up to watch. The case shook America. Still, the Cleveland Ripper, while arguably 100 times worse than Jack in terms of severity, was not major global news. His story was never printed on thousands and thousands of newspapers or even given a major Hollywood blockbuster treatment. Despite Ness's efforts, including 5,000 interviews, he couldn't get his man. He decided the best thing to do was burn the entire shanty town down, making very poor people even more desperate in the process. Even back then, such a hard-line act elicited widespread criticism. Ness was made more furious in 1938 when the killer left 2 of his victims, or parts of them, right near City Hall in clear view of Ness's office. This was an obvious taunt. Body parts were now being found on the